This is an exciting lesson because we're going to activate the Tanzu Kubernetes Grid service on VMware Cloud on AWS, which will allow us to start creating our first Kubernetes clusters. In the previous lesson, we discussed the TKG supervisor cluster. In this session, we'll activate the Tanzu Kubernetes Grid service, which will deploy a managed supervisor cluster for us. So without further ado, let's see how to activate the Tanzu Kubernetes Grid service on VMware Cloud on AWS. Let's first start by looking at the VMware Cloud on AWS SDDC before we activate the TKG service. Take a look at the list of virtual machines in the management resource pool. You'll see that we have some NSX resources and of course vCenter. We'll look at this again after we activate the TKG service. Now if we look at the workload management page, you'll also notice that workload management is currently not enabled. Let's stop wasting time and activate the service. I only have one SDDC in my environment, and that's where I'll activate the TKG service. If you have multiple SDDCs, you can select which one to use to activate the service on. I do want to point out that you should make sure to follow the minimum requirements for activating this TKG service. If your SDDC does not meet the minimum requirements for hosts or resources, or if it's a stretched cluster, the activation link will not work. We'll begin the activation process by clicking Activate Tanzu Kubernetes Grid from the Actions dropdown. On the first screen of the activation walkthrough, you'll be asked for 4 network CIDR ranges. These CIDR ranges are used by the TKG service when spinning up new clusters and networks. In general, these CIDR ranges should not overlap with your existing networks to prevent communication issues with your Kubernetes resources. Let's discuss each of these ranges briefly. First, we start with the service CIDR. This is for a network contained within the supervisor cluster in order to deploy Kubernetes services. The default value provided should work in almost all cases, but if you're future-proofing your deployment, you might consider using a non-overlapping address space just to be extra cautious. Next, we will need a CIDR for vSphere namespaces. We will discuss vSphere namespaces in a future lesson, but know that each namespace gets a network segment. These network segments are where your Tanzu Kubernetes clusters will be connected to your SDDC. You should be sure to provide a minimum of a /23 network range for this CIDR. The last 2 CIDRs are for ingress and egress into your Tanzu Kubernetes clusters. The ingress IP is assigned to a virtual IP to your load balancer to direct traffic to your Kubernetes API server and later to your deployed applications within your clusters. Each load balancer that is created for your Kubernetes cluster gets a virtual IP from this ingress CIDR range. Similarly, each vSphere namespace created shares an IP address for outbound traffic. The egress IP is a NAT address used for traffic exiting your vSphere namespace networks. If I just confused you with those CIDR ranges, just remember to avoid using overlapping networks with your existing networks. You might want to get a list of CIDRs from your networking team before completing the TKG activation lab. Once we've entered the network information, we can click Validate and Proceed, which will check your network addresses against known networks in your SDDC to see if there's an overlap. If there's no overlap, you'll be brought to the summary screen. Review the summary and click the Activate button. At this point, it will take around 20 minutes to activate the service. You should see some alerts pop up in your console as the cluster is activated. Once our activation is completed successfully, we can take a second look at our vCenter environment. The first thing we'll notice is that there is a new resource pool called namespaces. The second thing we might notice is that in our management resource pool, we now have 3 supervisor control plane VMs. These 3 VMs comprise the TKG supervisor cluster. And lastly, in the workload management screen, you can see that we are now asked to create a namespace instead of receiving a message that workload management is not enabled. So that wasn't too hard, was it? We just activated the Tanzu Kubernetes Grid service in our VMware Cloud on AWS SDDC in just a few steps. The trickiest part was finding some non-overlapping network ranges to get it stood up. Good luck in your lab. When I see you again, you should have the TKG service activated in your own SDDC. We'll see you next time.